Good morning. The homily today is for the first Sunday in Lent, and it's based on the Gospel, St. Mark, chapter 1, verses 9 to 15. On this, the first Sunday in the season of Lent, we remember the story of Jesus in the wilderness. Matthew and Luke both agree with Mark that Jesus was there for 40 days. John, on the other hand, is silent about the entire event. And both Matthew and Luke agree that this is not just a time of testing in the wilderness, but also a time of fasting. It is that part of the story that has influenced the traditional sense of Lent as a season of fasting. But of the three different Greek verbs that each of the Gospel writers uses to describe the scene when Jesus goes into the wilderness, Mark uses the strongest verb when he tells us that Jesus was sent into the wilderness. The way Mark tells it, it is almost as if Jesus were being plucked out of the baptism waters and thrown out into the wilderness. It seems as though there was no warning ahead of time. There was no time for him to pack a bag. There was no time to prepare meals. And there is just a sense of suddenly being driven into the wilderness. Maybe that has happened to you before. You were doing one thing when you were suddenly tasked with another and sent off to do something else. I can remember setting the table for dinner when my mom realized we were out of milk. So I was sent to the store, leaving the table for someone else to finish. According to Mark's telling of the story, however, we do not know what Jesus did once he got there. We know he was tempted by Satan, but that does not tell us what Jesus did. We know there were wild animals there, but that does not tell us what he did either. We also know the angels attended to his needs, but again, that does not tell us what Jesus did. So I began to wonder what I would do if the Spirit suddenly drove me away into the desert. What would it be like to be suddenly plopped down in the middle of the wilderness? Years ago, while I was still involved with scouting, I took a survival course to help me survive camping with the cubs. We were told to imagine we are flying cross-country over a sparsely populated area when the engine fails. After getting the plane on the ground, we are now faced with a series of questions and dilemmas that may make the difference between life and death. Getting on the ground is only part of the problem. We also must survive there. If we suddenly find ourselves caught in the middle of the desert or a wilderness area or an isolated setting, what should be the first thing we do? Well, the survival instructor began by reminding us that we can live a long time without food, maybe as long as 6 weeks. Jesus fasted for 40 days, after all. And for those who are not as good with your math, like me, 6 weeks would be 42 days. So searching for food should be low on our priority list. There will be plenty of time to find food. In a downed aeroplane, the first consideration is air. We can only live a few minutes without clean air to breathe. If there's smoke in the cockpit, you need to get out of the plane, he reminded us. If you are underwater, you need to get to the surface. Without clean air, a year's supply of food is useless. The next most important thing to consider is shelter. Depending on the location and the time of year, we can only be exposed to the elements for a matter of hours. Too hot or too cold, and we die. A fire for warmth has the added benefit of warding off most predatory animals. Another danger of the elements, especially here in Africa. After getting clean air and some shelter, the next most important thing is water. The human body can only live a matter of days without water. While it is not exactly accurate in a scientific way, you can survive anything from 3 to 6 days without water. But during that training, I heard a clear voice from God at that point, as the instructor told us to keep our priorities clear from the start. You can live 6 weeks without food. You can live 6 days without water. You can live 6 hours without shelter. You can live 6 minutes without air. But you cannot live 6 seconds without God. I have no doubt that the first thing Jesus did when he found himself in the wilderness was to pray. And the angels tended to him by sheltering him from wild animals, perhaps. But Jesus could not have survived without prayer, nor can we. Prayer is as essential to our lives as air and water, food and clothing. But there's something else. The assumption on the part of the survival instructor was that we do not intend to remain in isolation permanently. He assumed we would try to get help. He assumed people would be trying to find us too. It is the unnamed recognition that in addition to the necessities of life, we also need community. We were created as social beings that were meant to be in relationship with others. We were made for each other. Not even Jesus could live in isolation. Mark reminds us that angels tended to his needs, much as we tend to the needs of one another in this fellowship of people we call the church. Because we know we cannot live on our own, we become angels to each other. In times of sorrow, we bring comfort. In times of struggle, we bring hope. In times of temptation, we bring strength. In times of joy, we bring celebration. Just like Jesus learned in the wilderness, we are never alone in our struggles. That does not mean there will not be struggles. There are always temptations. There are always things that go bump in the night. But thanks be to God, we are not alone.